All right, let's get started with our webinar, which focuses on standing out from the crowd by utilizing the STAR method to highlight your achievements. Here's a quick overview of the topics we'll be covering today. First, we'll provide some background on what the STAR method actually is and the ways that it can be helpful for job seekers. Then we'll break down the instances in which it is or isn't appropriate to use the STAR method. Next, we'll go over ways and some examples of how you can apply the STAR method in written form for your application materials, meaning things like your resume and your cover letter. After that, we'll also go into some tangible examples of including STAR stories in your interview responses. And then we'll finish off our main presentation with some common mistakes to avoid when trying to use the STAR method before we end our overall webinar with our live audience Q&A so that you can ask your questions directly with one of our career experts. But before we dive into our first area of discussion, I would love if you all could respond to the poll question that should be popping up on your screen right about now. This question, which is about the biggest challenges that you personally face when trying to use the STAR method, will hopefully help us make sure that we are addressing your needs for this webinar topic. And even though the presentation portion of this webinar is pre-recorded, one of our career experts will be able to review the results of the poll and then go over those results live with you all before turning to the Q&A tab to answer your questions at the end of this webinar. So I'll go ahead and pause for a few more seconds so you all have a chance to read and answer the poll question. All right, thank you all for participating. Now, to begin our discussion, let's make sure that we're all on the same page about the STAR method. You've likely heard of it before, but you might be unclear about what it really is and how it works. So essentially, the STAR method is a framework that you can use to tell stories effectively. That's sort of the easiest way to think of it, a storytelling framework. I'm sure that we've all encountered instances in our lives where someone was trying to tell us a story, but it just didn't make sense. Maybe the sequence was all out of order, or it lacked relevant detail, or maybe it included a lot of random details that weren't important to the story and ended up just confusing us. The STAR method can help you avoid telling these types of confusing or unimpressive career stories and instead do the opposite. It will help you tell stories that will be relevant and impactful to your audience. And by your audience, I mean, recruiters, hiring managers, and even networking connections. It helps you make sure that your story is clear, concise, and includes all the important and logical components that make a good story. So here on this slide is a breakdown of what each aspect of the STAR method means and a little bit about what it entails. So first we have situation. Briefly describe the context and what was happening. Who was involved, what was your role in the story, kind of set the scene and then provide enough detail so that your listener understands the scenario. Then we have the task. Clearly define what you were specifically trying to achieve, or maybe the challenge you were trying to overcome. What were your goals or objectives in this situation? And then after task, we have action. Describe the specific steps you took to accomplish the task in this situation. Kind of walk them through what you did and why. And then lastly, we have the result. Here is where you explain the outcomes of your action. Were your actions beneficial, or did they fail to accomplish the task? If there was a negative outcome, how would you do things differently in the future? As part of the result, it's also helpful to kind of outline the greater impact you had on others, like maybe your team or the company or your customers, and also to quantify that impact if possible. For example, maybe you increase sales by 15%, or resolved customer complaints within 24 hours. So keep those kind of things in mind when developing your result with your star story. And also, were there any kind of learnings or takeaways that you gained from the experience that are relevant and worth sharing with your audience? All of these components make up a strong result for you to include in these types of stories. And it can also be helpful to have kind of a checklist as you're working to put together your star stories. You can ask yourself some questions like, would someone with no prior knowledge of this story understand what I'm describing? Have I described the situation, the task, the action, and the result with clarity? Did I use, specific examples and quantifiable results wherever I was able to? Did I, highlight my specific skills and contributions effectively? Is my response engaging and comprehensible for my listener? Considering those types of questions can help you make sure that your stories are on the right track. And then some people are not fans of the star method. So if you want to use some alternatives, there are some good ones out there that you can consider using. Some are a bit simpler than the star method. Some are a bit more complex. Some are very, very similar to the star method, but they all basically convey, the same things and help you tell a more logical, well-organized story. So here are a few options that you can consider on this slide. There's the PAR method, which stands for problem, action, result, CAR, challenge, action, result, SOAR, situation, obstacle, action, result, STARry, situation, task, action, result, impact, and STARL, situation, task, action, result, lesson. And I know those last two, they are, the STAR method just with some extras, but I particularly like those last two because they incorporate the impact of your actions beyond just the general result or the lesson that you learn from that experience. Both of those can be valuable to include in your star story, depending on the situation that you're describing. For example, if I was telling a story about a time that I made a mistake, adding in the lesson that I learned from making that mistake would make a lot of sense. So just some different options to consider. But again, they all kind of convey sort of the same thing and help you tell that more logical, well-organized story. Okay, so now let's talk about the situations in which it makes sense to use the STAR method, as well as a few, scenarios in which you wouldn't want to use the STAR method. So the nice thing about STAR is that it's pretty versatile. You can use it to tell stories both in writing and verbally, which means that you can use it in, your application materials, like we mentioned, but also in like outreach emails. Obviously you could use it during interviews, but you could also use it in, networking discussions or other professional conversations, like maybe your annual review conversation with your supervisor. So when you're in a situation where you're kind of trying to explain, your skills or your abilities, or maybe discussing the responsibilities of a potential future role, it's a good idea to use star stories to explain, how you've done certain things effectively in the past or achieved, maybe similar results to the ones that your audience is hoping you might be able to achieve for them in the future. You can think of it as almost like providing evidence or proof of your abilities, particularly if you can highlight specific metrics or quantifiable results, because this will then kind of give your listener confidence in your abilities and your ability to be successful in that role if you are using it in an instance where you're applying or interviewing for a job. And star stories are also applicable to general situations when you're describing your ability to, something like work with a team or collaborate with others or overcome a challenge, but they can also be used in role specific scenarios where you might be describing how you solved a specific problem, used a particular software program, or navigated a specific process. So again, we're seeing that sort of versatility of these star stories. And the reason all of these uses of star are helpful is because you always want to try to go beyond just kind of basic descriptions of the things you've done in the past, like, the general responsibilities that you held at work. Instead, you want to try to show the impact, the positive impact that you had on your team or your organization. What was the value that you brought to the table? That is so much more important than just listing out the past tasks that you had in a previous role. Star stories can help you emphasize that impact much more clearly. And there are, on the flip side, some instances where you would not want to use the star method. So, for instance, when you're describing kind of generic or irrelevant experiences, like situations that don't connect to the specific job you're applying for, or don't showcase, relevant skills that align with the employer's needs. I also would avoid using star stories when answering questions with specific prompts that ask you to directly respond to that prompt and provide just kind of a concise, relevant answer or example without kind of forcing in the star structure. So, for instance, I wouldn't use the star story to respond to the question, what is your greatest weakness? Because I want to describe my weakness and then explain how I'm aiming to overcome that weakness. There's no real need for a star story there. Similarly, I wouldn't use a star story if they asked about like a hypothetical situation. Like maybe they ask, imagine a client asks you to walk them through a specific task. How would you do that? I would just describe my process for explaining the task to the client and verifying that they understood how to do the task themselves. And then also situations that are maybe lacking clear accomplishments or clear lessons. Maybe you might struggle to identify a clear result or lesson from a specific experience. It wouldn't make much sense to describe just the situation, task, or action if there's no result to finish with. But I will say that, using star is definitely applicable in more situations than not, but you want to think of it as a valuable tool to structure your stories, not a rigid formula that you must use 100% of the time. So just use your judgment and adapt your approach to best answer questions and highlight your strengths and experiences in a compelling way. All right, so now let's dive a bit deeper into how you can incorporate star stories into your written materials like your resume and your cover letter. So, like we mentioned previously, it is perfectly fine to use star stories in your written materials. And in fact, it can help you convey your skills, achievements, and positive impact more effectively to your audience in a way that will be relevant to them. Now, relevance is the key here. You don't want to kind of waste your time writing out star stories for your resume or cover letter if they aren't going to be relevant to your audience. This means that you need to make sure that you're doing your research into, individual companies and specific fields to know what will be valuable and important to decision makers within those types of industries or organizations. This type of information can help you determine kind of what to include in your descriptions of past jobs on your resume and how to frame the stories that you tell in your resume bullet points. Similarly, when applying for specific jobs, you want to pay careful attention to job descriptions. Job descriptions are extremely helpful in determining the stories you want to tell to this specific audience that will best demonstrate your fit for this specific role, which is particularly helpful for tailoring your cover letter and also in preparing for interviews, which is the topic that we will discuss in our next section. But the biggest thing to remember with your written materials is that you need your star stories to be concise, meaning they should be short and to the point. I always aim to keep each bullet point on my resume to a maximum of 2 lines, and you want your cover letter to stick to 1 page. So it might take you some time to perfect your ability to write star stories in a concise manner, but it is an important skill to master. And I'll share some solid examples for you on the next slide, which will hopefully make this a bit easier for you. But something else to consider about written star stories is that you don't necessarily need to include all of the star elements. For example, you might want to kind of combine the situation and the task, or you could maybe leave out the task by kind of including that a little bit in the action. And you might also use the elements of the star method in a different order. Like maybe you are mentioning the result earlier on in the story in order to kind of grab attention more quickly. But let's look at some examples so that you can see what I mean a bit more effectively here. So here are some examples of some written star stories that could work for your resume bullet points. I wanted to show some examples that could be relevant to a wide audience. So I focused here on common professional occurrences like working with customers or trying to improve processes, as well as some stories related to transferable skills like problem solving and communication. So I'll pause here for a moment to give you a chance to read through all of these. So right there in that first sample star story, you'll see an example of what I just mentioned on the last slide. We have the result mentioned early on in the bullet point rather than saving it to the end. That first sample story there is also a good example of kind of combining the situation and the task together into one kind of succinct statement at the start of the bullet point. Also, I want to point out that third sample about communication. You'll see that that sample highlights how you can still tell an effective star story and explain your positive results even when you don't have quantifiable metrics to include. But either way, each one of these examples does a solid job of going beyond simply explaining a responsibility you held in a past job, and instead kind of paints a picture of how you work and the positive impact or value that you're able to bring to the table, all while being concise enough to fit in a single bullet point on a resume. Okay, now let's talk about using star stories to help improve the quality of your responses in an interview setting. So, similar to written content about your career experiences, star stories in an interview allow you to back up your responses with some proof or evidence of you being able to do the things you claim to be capable of. So, for example, if I was asked in an interview about my greatest strength and I claimed that I was a really good problem solver and really enjoyed solving problems by implementing creative solutions, but never actually gave any examples of problems that I solved or solutions that I implemented, who is actually going to believe me that that is my greatest strength? So backing up your responses with a story, particularly using the STAR framework, will allow you to give evidence to support your claims in an interview. And when you're preparing for an interview, it's helpful to think about the types of stories that you'll want to tell. And there are two specific ways that I go about this during my own interview preparations. First, I'll think of, kind of my own career highlights. What are the 5 or so best stories from my career that showcase some of my best qualities or abilities? Those are likely stories that I'll want to tell because they show me in a positive light. Then, once I think about those top career highlights, I'll start to consider how those stories could potentially relate back to the job at hand, because relevance is important, like we talked about. And that relevance, actually brings us to the second approach for thinking of types of stories to tell, which is using the job description as my guide. I actually like to print out the job description and go through it line by line, jotting down ideas for stories and examples I can tell that showcase my ability to do the things that are listed in that description. Then I can go back to those notes as I continue to prepare and kind of build out my stories a bit more fully. Now, it's also important to leave room for adaptability. What I mean by this is that you have no idea the exact questions that you'll be asked in a given interview. You can get a general idea by reviewing the job description and considering some general and role specific questions, but you really have no way of knowing the exact questions that they will use. So because of this, you want to think about stories that can be, applied to different topics. For instance, the approach I mentioned just a minute ago with printing out the job descriptions. Let's say that the job description has 50 bullet points. That doesn't mean that I have 50 stories prepared going into an interview. I usually have somewhere around 10 stories ready to go, but most of my stories can be applied across multiple bullet points in that job description or related to multiple topics. So to give an example, a story that I might share about interacting with like an upset client could obviously be shared as a story for a question about my customer service skills if they were to ask about that, but it could also potentially be used as a story for questions related to handling a challenging situation, remaining calm under pressure, solving problems, or even my ability to communicate effectively, all of which could be implicitly or explicitly mentioned in that job description. So this type of adaptability will allow you to be better prepared for questions that you might not expect to be asked during your interview. And then lastly, it can be helpful to practice your stories. This doesn't mean that you want to necessarily rehearse and memorize them word for word, but take time to kind of think about each component of the STAR method for each story that you've prepared so that you're able to recall them more easily during the actual interview process. If you're able to go through each story and recall the situation, the task, the action, and the result, you should be able to remember them more easily and tell them effectively during an interview in a way that makes logical sense and resonates with the listener without you having to memorize them word for word. Now, let's look at some examples of STAR stories that you could tell in interviews. All right, so I have a couple examples over the next few slides, and I won't read them all to you, but let's dissect this first one together. This first story is one about mastering a new system or process. So for situation, we have in my previous role, our company adopted a new CRM system to streamline customer interactions, and I was tasked with becoming the team expert. For task, we have my responsibility was to understand the intricacies of the system, customize it according to our needs, and train the team for a smooth transition. For action, I dedicated extra hours to self-learning, attended advanced training sessions, and collaborated with the IT department to troubleshoot issues. And then for our result, within 3 weeks, not only had I mastered the new system, but I also created a comprehensive user guide that was specific to our team's needs. This allowed for a seamless transition, resulted in 15% increased efficiency, and improved our overall customer data management. Now you can see how this example follows the STAR framework pretty closely. Because this would be a story that we would tell during an interview and not one that we're trying to quickly write in a 1 or 2 page document, it doesn't have to be quite so concise as it would be, on our resume. That means that we can tell each component of the story in the STAR order. And it's also worth noting, like we talked about on the previous slide, that this story could apply to several different types of interview questions. For instance, this story would obviously apply to a question where they asked about, mastering a new system or process quickly, particularly a CRM or customer relationship management system. But it could also apply to questions that related to your ability to teach or train others, a time where you helped improve efficiencies, your efforts to support a positive customer experience, adapting to change or a new way of doing things, or even your problem-solving skills. With a few minor tweaks, this story can easily be adapted to a pretty broad range of situations. So this is the type of thing you want to think about as you develop your stories, trying to make them adaptable. All right, so here's another sample STAR story that you could tell in an interview, and I'll pause for a moment so that you can read this one on your own. So here's another example where we don't specifically have a quantifiable result to share, but we're still including the positive result. You often hear the advice, quantify your results. You have to quantify your results. That is a good idea, but not every job and not every situation lends itself to a lot of quantifiable metrics. You can still tell impactful stories and write, relevant bullet points, even if they lack quantifiable outcomes. So I wanted to make sure to include some examples of that, which you'll also see on the next slide. And again, this story could relate to a few different questions or situations. It could obviously relate to managing a conflict with a colleague, but it could also relate to your ability to handle a challenge, your problem solving skills, how you go about ensuring team buy-in, or your collaborative decision making skills. Okay, so here is our last example. And once again, I will pause so you have a chance to read it on your own. Once again, we have some impactful results to share with no specific metrics. And once again, this could relate to a variety of questions, like ones about taking initiative, setting goals, your commitment to professional development, how you adapt to changes or trends, streamlining processes or improving efficiencies, or even about a time where you had a positive impact on a previous team. So once again, we're seeing that adaptability with these star stories. Okay, so hopefully those examples were helpful for you in building an understanding of how to craft an effective star story. So now let's finish up with some common mistakes to avoid when you are creating your star stories. Okay, so some of these will be a reiteration of some of the things we've touched on already, but others we haven't mentioned yet. Either way, here is a rundown of common mistakes to avoid when working with star stories. So remember to not put the focus on the tasks or the responsibilities of each role, and instead try to emphasize your own actions and the results or the impact that you were able to achieve. Try to avoid being too vague or not providing enough relevant information. But then on the flip side, be careful not to fill your stories with irrelevant information or unnecessary details. Try to strike an appropriate balance there. Similarly to being too vague, try not to let your stories get off topic. This is a big reason why preparing your stories ahead of time and practicing them is a good idea. It helps you make sure that your stories will stay relevant to your audience. And here's one we haven't really touched on yet. Avoid fixating on the negatives. Like, sure, your stories might include negative aspects like a mistake you made or a conflict you experienced, but then remember to try to flip things around and end on a positive note. So what did you learn, or how would you do things differently in the future? Kind of gloss over the negatives and then focus on the positives. And it should hopefully be obvious, but make sure you aren't overly embellishing your stories or lying about something that didn't actually happen. You want to be honest, but also remember that it's okay to brag about yourself and your accomplishments. You need to advocate for yourself in your application materials and in interview settings. Keep in mind that while you don't have to quantify results in order to describe your successes, quantifying results when possible and applicable can bolster the impact of your stories. And then lastly avoid the mistake of not tailoring your stories and experiences to each specific role, whether in your application materials or in your interview responses. Always think about your audience and what will be relevant and important to them. So as we close out here, let's look at a few final reminders and action steps that you can take going forward. So first take the time to understand how to craft an effective star story so you can begin to include them in your application materials and your interview responses. Make sure that you understand when it is or isn't appropriate to use a star story. Aim to include some star stories in your application materials so you can effectively convey your relevant accomplishments. And then don't forget to prepare your stories ahead of time and practice them without memorizing them word for word so you aren't trying to think up examples on the fly during an interview. We will now go ahead and move to our Q&A portion of the webinar. Just as a quick reminder, a copy of the recording, as well as any resources that were discussed during the presentation, will be emailed within a week to the email address you used to register for today's event. Do be sure to check your spam folder just in case it gets filtered there. For even more tips, tricks, and resources, I recommend going to the FlexJobs blog. You'll see the URL there on the screen. It has a vast amount of free articles, resources, webinars, and videos for members and non-members alike. Now let's go ahead and open up to your questions. Please remember to type them in the Q&A area rather than the chat section, and feel free to give a thumbs up to anyone else's questions you'd also like to have answers so we know which ones are the most popular.
Hello, all. This is Tony. Happy to be here today to answer your questions. There's some really good ones coming in, and this was some great content from Keith. So hopefully you thought so as well. For the poll, just to kind of bring that up again, we had sort of mixed results with all of the answers. The top two answers were being new to Star Stories, so not being quite sure what the biggest challenge is. And the second most popular answer was keeping your stories concise and avoiding rambling. Now, that's certainly more difficult, I think, on a resume, right? When we have to be concise in an interview, it can certainly be much more conversational. But yes, we do need to pay attention to how much we are talking. So we can kind of go through some of that as we're talking through the answers to these questions, because I think it really does apply to those poll results. Number one, if you are trying to transition from one career to another, how do you use STAR to show that you have the skills, just not in the industry you are applying for now? This is a great question. And actually, I had to exercise this when I was interviewed here at FlexJobs. I was going through a career transition. I was switching careers. I did not have experience as a career coach 6 years ago. But I was a coach in a different industry. So one of the questions was, and this was not even related to coaching necessarily. The question was something like, tell me about a time when you had to bring a team together to build consensus. And the first thing that came to my mind, because I hadn't thought of that question prior to the interview, was some volunteer work I did as a military spouse with military spouses from Norway and Italy and the US who were all in the same unit. And so it was not paid work that I shared for that example, but it was something that I could use to highlight my transferable skills and skills that would be really beneficial when I was working with people from different backgrounds in a coaching environment. And so think about not just the paid opportunities or the paid things that you have done in your career, but also any other things that you have done that could be applicable or a relevant story to tell based on the job that you are applying for. I think sometimes we get hung up in this place that only we can talk about what we've done if we've been paid for it. And that's really just not true. We develop skills in other areas and other places, and we use them outside of work all of the time. So feel okay sharing an experience that might be outside of your 9 to 5 job. Is there a specific format for STAR that are resume software compliant? I don't think specific to STAR, no. I think you still want to adhere to the regular ATS rules and making sure your resume is compliant for the ATS or ATS friendly. And actually, I'll give a plug to our ATS webinar that we have coming up tomorrow. So if you haven't registered for that yet, go ahead and do that. We've updated that, and we'll be here for questions on that topic as well. So that might be helpful for you to have the recording there if you have questions about ATS compliance issues. Let's see. Can we talk more about STAR examples without quantifiable examples? Yeah. So the example that I just gave about kind of pulling people together who came from different backgrounds was not something I was able to quantify. I think if you have certain activities or, maybe like relationship building star situations, those aren't necessarily going to have quantifiable examples, but you might be able to say that we were able to streamline a process because of this. One of the things and actually, I think that's something that could be a result for many of us if you share ideas with people that you collaborate with to maybe add a meeting to the calendar so that you can make sure that everybody's on the same page with each of the different activities they're doing and how it relates to the company goals and overall objectives. You might be able to say that you were able to, connect with members of the company, cross collaboration, those types of things in order to, ensure that company OKRs and KPIs were met. And you can talk about it in those ways. All right. This is an interesting question, and I really had to think about it, but I think the answer is yes. Can STAR method be utilized using ChatGPT? So I think the way that I would use this if I was going to use an AI tool, I would say, help me answer the behavioral interview question. Tell me about a time when you had to resolve conflict on your team, or whatever the question is. I would like the answer to be in the format of STAR: situation, task, action, and result. And here is the story that I'm thinking about sharing. And then you can enter your information and then see what kind of result you get from Chat GPT or Google Gemini. Now, I'm going to caution you, do not read that or do not memorize that and have that be the answer that you share in your interview. You need to then take whatever information STAR gives you, use it as a tool, a brainstorming mechanism, in order for you then to make sure that that answer is tailored to you, your experience, and it is in your voice. But I definitely think you can use this as a tool. I think it could help with efficiencies when we're practicing these answers and practicing for interviewing, because there's a lot to do and it can be overwhelming. And I think that anything that can help us be more efficient and give us ideas, because of course the adrenaline and the nerves are high when we're preparing for an interview, at least for me. All right. Let's see. What if you don't have a lot of scenario to use STAR stories? Can you invent one based on your experience? You always want to be honest and truthful and share real experiences that you have had. Hopefully, it's helpful to give yourself permission to think about some of these scenarios outside of a work environment. And perhaps you'll be able to draw on some different life experiences outside of work that can help you as you prepare these questions. Where would you put taking the initiative to learn a new skill on the resume and incorporate it in the cover letter? I think I am mainly trying to stand out on a resume and cover letter. I think you could add taking initiative to learn a new skill in a couple different places. You might have a skill section on your resume. You might say taking initiative, and it might be with other skills like verbal and written communication and so on. Or in your technology section where you list your technologies, I often would include a sentence like, uh, readily takes on new technologies independently to increase efficiency and communication across the team. But you could use the word initiative, takes initiative to learn new technologies. You could do it that way. You could also say that in your cover letter. If you want to show that you've taken initiative, you also can use that in some of your bullets. Initiated a new process that led to this result. You don't have to say the phrase taking initiative. You can use the verb initiates, initiating, initiated on your resume bullets as well. All right. How do you answer in an interview why you want to leave your job? I don't like my job any longer. Well, with this, you want to be forward thinking um, and say something positive. You don't want to dwell on the fact that you don't like your job. You can simply say something like, I am looking to expand my capabilities or my opportunity, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to do this type of work. Of course, you're going to be more specific in a role like this. I am also very committed to X, Y, and Z, which I know your company is committed about as well because of your mission statement. And I'm really looking forward to future opportunities. You could also say something like, I've been in this role at this company for 5 years. I've really learned a lot. I would like to continue growing in my career, and I'm looking for opportunities that will allow me to do that and move on. How can you quantify receptionist duties? Couple things, depending on what you're doing, you might be able to quantify the volume of phone calls or people that come in the office every day. You might be able to quantify, if you're managing a schedule or travel arrangements, you might be able to put a dollar amount on how the value of the travel arrangements you make per year, or how many different travel arrangements or meetings or attendees that you have to manage for all of those types of things. Those are some things that you might be able to think about that you could try and quantify. Okay, we answered that. I think I get hung on the behavioral or cultural fit in interviews. Do you have advice for these areas? Yeah, I think part of this is also you asking questions back to them. Or if they're asking a question like, how do you work and prioritize multiple different projects? Certainly you can give a star answer in that area, but you could also say at the end, I know that this is a fast-paced environment and a team that has a lot of projects going at the same time. What are some strategies you've employed on your team that work well for your team? And you can find out some more information from them there. And that kind of becomes a little bit more conversational, if you will, during the interview. Should we ever write why the task is the task? In an example provided, there was an arm waving task. We should improve this communication during conflict. The task is implied but not described. If you are putting this on your resume, I'm not sure that you are going to have the space to be able to get that much detail. In other words, you have to be really concise in your resume bullets. Now, if you're talking about it in an interview, you probably have more, not probably, you do have more time and quote unquote space to kind of paint the picture a little bit more because they're not limited to a 2-page resume. What is the standard header content that's expected within resumes? I've been out of the job scene for 5 years, and while I'm familiar with using star interviews, I've never used it on my resume or cover letter. All right, I would go to the resources section and visit the library of samples to get some examples for yourself, because if you're going back in the workforce and looking to update your resume, that can be really helpful for you. Resumes have a professional summary and a work experience section, an education section, oftentimes a technology section, and sometimes a skills section as well. How recently or when did STAR come up, or the alternatives? That's a great question. I'm not sure exactly when the STAR acronym or some of the other acronyms came up. Behavioral interviewing sort of hit the scene a little bit in the 70s, or it was really talked about then. And I think ever since then, it's sort of grown in, I don't know if popularity is the right word, but employers are really looking for a good cultural fit to an organization. They're looking for a good fit on the team with the working style and all of those types of things. And so these types of interview questions have become more and more common as the years have passed. And I think employees, or us as job seekers, are also really in tune and wanting to find a really good fit. And so it's sort of a circular way to try to kind of find out some of this information. This will probably be the last question. I know we're getting to time. What kind of questions should we ask it during an interview when they ask if we have any questions for them? I think any type of culturally based questions that are relevant to you in terms of what type of environment is good for you to work in. If work-life balance is important to you and the company proclaims their employees have work-life balance on their website, it's perfectly fine to say, I know one of your company values is that your employees have some work-life balance. What are some things your team does or this team does to embody that value? You might say, I understand that there is a pretty generous PTO policy here. Do you find that when team members take their PTO, that they still remain connected to the team, or are they able to unplug, or how do you unplug? Those types of things. You might ask, what was a recent win on the team? What is a challenge that the team is working through right now? You could ask questions like about professional development. You could ask questions about when was the last time you promoted somebody on the team and why. What are you most excited about for this team in the next 1, 2, or 3 years? That can really give you some insight into the forward-thinking nature of the people that are interviewing you and what they're looking forward to or what they are challenged with on the team. So hopefully that's helpful. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We always appreciate you spending time with us and coming in with really great questions that we can answer for you. Again, we are going to send you this recording within the next several days. So look for that in your email address, and we hope to see you at our next event. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. Bye-bye.